In the last episode, episode 2 of our series, we learned how autoimmunity is intricately tied to what happens in the gut. We deeply explore how, if we can heal the gut, we can reverse and arrest autoimmune disease. From symptoms like chronic fatigue, brain fog, and joint pain, to illnesses like full-blown autoimmune diseases, MS, rheumatoid arthritis, we now know that it all begins in the gut. Episode 2 is your starting point to understanding that process. We also looked at the miraculous role of vitamin D in healing and how vitamin D deficiencies are monumental and cause the ultimate breakdown of vital bodily functions. I hope you took copious notes for the last episode because that information, the secrets of vitamin D and its vital role in health, and the groundbreaking foundational information on the gut are two key building blocks in what happens for the rest of your life and for those you love and care about. Hopefully you've purchased the series and you can listen to it again and again and again. In this episode, we deep dive into the microbiome. The medical community has long viewed microbes as something to destroy. Why is that? Our understanding around microbes was born in illness and searching for cures for things like influenza and measles and smallpox. But the idea that bacteria are bad and hold only one role in our ecosystem is not only a misunderstanding, it's actually dangerous to us as individuals and as a species. It was Louis Pasteur, the father of the germ theory, who said on his deathbed, "The microbe is nothing, the terrain is everything." He's talking about the microbiome. We are more and more aware, as scientific and medical community leaders, that microbes keep us healthy and control our ability to ward off disease and do simple tasks like run digestion and immunity. Nurturing healthy bacteria is of paramount importance in this new millennia. In fact, new generations of medications are being developed that kill harmful bacteria and leave the friendly good bacteria alone. And in other arenas, bacteria are being explored and used as carrying agents to cure illnesses like cancer. I've been asked many times over the years, if there's only one thing, Doc, I'm going to do, just one thing, what is it? And the answer is the same. Fix your microbiome, the most important thing you can do. The information you will hear on this episode is, in many cases, brand new and utterly life-changing. This is where you learn what can build or completely destroy good bacteria and how to create a healing process that begins in the microbiome and spreads to your entire body and impacts on your entire life. Because health is wealth, and it starts at the very core, the microbiome.
I would probably say all my life I thought I was a really healthy person. Exercised, ate well, did all the right things. And then when I hit my 40s, my body literally started falling apart. I had shingles, I lost a tooth, and then I went into this serious fatigue where I just needed a nap every day at 3 o'clock. And I knew something was wrong. And I decided not to see a typical doctor, a regular MD, because I was worried that I would be prescribed some kind of pill or something. And so I was looking for the right doctor, a functional medicine doctor. And so I found one through a girlfriend, and when I saw him, he told me that I was gluten intolerant. And that explained everything that was going on with me, all the changes in my body. It was just tremendous pain, and I had a rash. And it affected the nerves. And so I was put on medication, antibiotics, and that took care of it. But what I was finding was that I was still weak. I was still tired. At 3 o'clock or 12 o'clock, sometime in the afternoon, I just wanted to go back to bed. So I wasn't able to function. I wasn't able to stay and take care of my family and do the things I needed to do for them.
How'd that affect you?
It was horrible. It was horrible. Because as a mother, when you have 3 young children, you want to take care of them. And I didn't know what was wrong. Then there was the mystery of what is wrong with me.
Each of us has a microbiome of our skin, our lungs, our eyes, our nostrils, and genitourinary tract, and really every organ has a microbiome of its own. And in fact, they're so different that I could have a 70% different microbes on this hand than this hand.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating,
Yes,
isn't it?
yeah.
And I think that's that left-handed, right-handed thing.
Yes.
And we have somewhere between 2 and 6 pounds of microbes in our gut, and they really modulate our immune system. They are us. You know, we like to think of them as separate. There's fungi, there's bacteria, and there's viruses. And the viruses have phages, which are actually viruses that eat bacteria and keep them under control. And
so viruses aren't all bad for us.
They're not all bad, just like bacteria aren't all bad.
Right.
And in fact, these microbes actually terraform the planet. They're the reason we breathe oxygen and why plants breathe carbon dioxide. They are in every cell in our body. Many of the little organelles in our nuclei in every cell actually are bacterial symbiotes, the most important one being the mitochondria, which are our energy factories in every single cell that help us turn food into energy, so we have heat in our body. And you know, we hear that they're not us, but the truth is that we're this one big symbiote, and they have an intelligence about them, and they live in big communities. And when these communities get out of balance, we get illness, like autoimmune conditions, we get diabetes, obesity, mental health issues, cancers. It goes on and on.
You have literally thousands of different organisms that will live within our intestinal tract that have their own genetics, they have their own genes, they're not the same as our genes, and they're all different one from the other based upon the species of their lineage. And you start saying, well, aren't most of those friendly? Well, it is true that if you look at 1 gram of stool, and this is not a topic most people want to talk about, but we'll quickly talk about it. 1 gram of stool has more bacteria in it than there are stars in the known universe. Now that's pretty profound, right?
That is profound.
Like more than 10 to the 13th bacteria in 1 gram of stool. Okay. Now of that 10 to the 13th bacteria, how many of them are hostile to the body? Well, we would normally say in a healthy person, very few of them, maybe 10 to the 3rd, 10 to the 4th, 1,000 to 10,000 out of 10 to the 13th. So it's a rounding error. You wouldn't even know them to be.
They're completely surrounded. They're overwhelmed.
That's right.
They can't puff their chest and
precisely. So they've got all these what are called symbiotic bacteria or commensals that hold them in check, just as you're saying. But if you get a disruption of that balance, and it doesn't require them to become the dominant bacteria within our gut, but just a higher voice in the symphony of all these campers that are in our intestinal tracts, now suddenly the old meeting around the campfire is not so friendly anymore. Now your immune system sees those bacteria and their debris, because they die and they release their contents to the gut mucosa. They can be things like lipopolysaccharides, which are part of their gut wall structure, that then induce the immune system to say, oh, foreigners, we better call out the guards and start doing battle. So your point about the gut and the microbiome as being a major contributor to how our immune system is working either well or in a state of hostility is a very, very important part of this whole emerging story. And that gives us another place that we can intervene, which is to do things that make the environment of the gut friendly.
So do you see how important your microbiome is? When you've thought about being healthy or eating healthy, have you directly tied that outcome to having healthy communities in your microbiome? It's out of this world, isn't it? But it's critically important. Many of us have a lot of damage to repair as we've blasted our microbiome through the antibiotics we've taken and the other harmful environmental triggers we've been exposed to. I admit, I grew up on Mountain Dew and Hostess apple pies. Not a good thing. The good news is that the bodies are forgiving. You can restore your microbiome, and we're going to be continually sharing with you the most cutting-edge information on how to do that throughout this entire series from this point forward. Now let's have a look at autoimmune disease in the developing world, also referred to as the third world. Looking at the health challenges that we face in the first world scenarios, would you expect the developing world to have better or worse gut bacterial situations? The answer might shock you.
If you look at autoimmune disease, it really is a disease of the Western industrialized world, or a disease class, right? Yes. Because if you go to the underdeveloped world, or the third world, if you will, a big difference between us and them is they live in comparative filth. Okay, I mean, they don't have the kind of public hygiene. They're often living upstream, taking water out of the river, cooking with it, going to the bathroom in it, putting waste in it, and then the village downstream is taking the water out of the river. That
the same thing, right?
Yeah. So and that can be bad. I mean, you can have outbreaks, you can have dysentery. I mean, you can have bad stuff, but they're usually acute things. You either live through it, you survive, and it resolves, or you don't, right? But you certainly learn how to deal with your environment. Your immune system becomes probably stronger to the things that are really a threat that you have to react to, but it becomes much more tolerant to a large array of things that, your immune system is almost saying, like, listen, I can't react to all of this, or, it's just not possible. I have to size it up, and I have to pick my battles.
Right.
We're exposed to so little now. We live in these little semi-sterile things we called houses, with carpet and draperies, off-gassing toxins, and, mom's afraid to let the baby crawl in the dirt or get dirty because, that's bad, and so they're scrubbing them with all this soap all day long, and, they just don't sample their environment. So sooner or later, they're going to run into these things, and if their immune system doesn't know how to size it up right, they're going to tend to be overreactive to everything.
Right, because we know bacteria mutate generation to generation. Yes. So they're so supremely adapted to live on this earth. Our ancestors, who were hunters, gatherers, foragers, ate dirt, lived among the dirt, and actually got huge doses of these guys every day. So we developed this amazing symbiotic relationship where we give them a home and they protect the home. And they protect the home in so many different profound ways. It's even hard to imagine. Just everything from even digesting your food.
If we look at the Hadza tribe, which is a hunter-gatherer tribe that live in Tanzania, or the Amerindians in South America, and compare their bacterial compositional diversity to somebody in a European city, which has been done in a couple of studies, we see about a 60% reduction in diversity compared to our nearest hunter-gatherer cousins. So we have to ask the question, what is it that they're doing that's so different compared to what we're doing?
It's rare that they have autoimmune diseases.
Correct.
In the African cultures.
So exactly right, Tom. You see a shift in their risk for reduced lifespan tends to be by trauma or infection. Our risk for reduced lifespan tends to be by autoimmune disease, or what's called non-communicable diseases, which are diabetes, heart disease, cancer, upper respiratory tract and respiratory tract diseases. So obviously the question that tends to run through everyone's mind is, well, is there a set of organisms that are missing that was so absolutely essential to protect us that we can replace? Or is it the way that we look after them, as you've been indicating? Is it something that we're doing generation after generation that's removing this diversity?
Imagine that you live in America, in New York, for example, or in Chicago, and you are going into your late 20s to Malaysia, or to Africa, to Angola.
Yes.
Yeah. It's unlike you to develop autoimmune disease.
It's unlikely?
It's unlikely to you to develop an autoimmune disease. Mm-hmm. But if you put, in the other side, if you put a family in another country, if you put an African family, an Afro-American family in America, in the second and the third generation, you will start to have autoimmune disease, and severe ones. Because they are going to start to be less exposed.
Yes.
That will happen like that.
So their protection is reduced.
Yes.
The next generation,
yes,
their protection is reduced.
Yes, of course. It's more a burden than a theory for our lifestyle. Our nowadays lifestyle is more a burden of antigens exposure. That is the possible explanation of that. And it's quite beautiful because it's infinite, the possibility to recognize foreign antigens.
So our immune systems we've been developed with the ability to recognize so many foreign antigens.
Yeah.
And in this country, we're not exposed to that. I'm sorry, in the United States or in any industrialized country, we're not exposed to as many. So that it makes us more vulnerable to developing the autoimmune mechanisms.
Yes, of course.
I have young kids, and I walk through their elementary school, and every single classroom has warning signs on it. You know, child, you know, in this room, child allergic to peanuts, child allergic to corn, child allergic to dairy. And, you know, it's no joke. They have like anaphylactic level, really serious stuff. I mean, life-threatening stuff. So it's not just hypersensitivity to, you know, the idea that kids have food sensitivities. I mean, it's real. I mean, these are challenging times. Kids' immune systems are effectively off the rails. I mean, they're not behaving even like when we were kids at all. And there's a lot of very interesting data emerging in the medical literature, particularly in the immunology literature, looking at the difference in immune response between, let's say, kids who are living in an underdeveloped country versus kids that live in a Western developed industrialized country. But even beyond that, they parse it much more than that. They look at kids, let's say in the United States, who live in cities, kids who live in suburbs, kids who live on farms, or in an urban versus suburban versus rural environment. Their immune systems act very differently, and they have much different prevalences of autoimmune diseases, and diseases particularly that we would consider atopic, you know, things like reactive airway, asthma, you know, urticaria, I mean, all those dermatitis type of things, these very, very reactive things. And basically, kids who grow up on farms, particularly smaller farms where they come into contact with livestock, you know, lots of different animals, particularly if they're drinking raw milk, they're you know, eating a lot of things right locally off the farm, their immune systems are generally much more balanced, much more healthy. Their GI microbiota is much more diverse, and they don't have autoimmune disease. They don't have asthma. They don't have hay fever. They don't have all these things that most kids in the suburbs and cities now are racked with.
It's such a problem that our children face living in the suburbs. There's clearly something to be learned from the children with healthy gut bacteria living on farms. We can gain a lot from seeing how the children's behavior is connected to their gut health. The key is that whatever the circumstance we live in, we have the tools available to create the best possible environment within our bodies with the choices we make. Now, let's have a look at the immune system. The immune system is vital, as we all know. A healthy immune system keeps us fighting colds and flus and serious diseases such as cancer. We all get cancer cells. Every day we get cancer cells. It's just a question of whether our immune system can take care of them or not. It's something we all know we need to have intact. But did you know that there's a direct connection between the microbiome and the immune system? This is a key missing link, which is the reason people often fail to have effective functioning immune systems.
Part of it is that our immune system is quite a bit under control by the rest of the good bacteria in the gut. You know, the immune system is almost naive in a way. So, you know, I always explain to people the immune system is like this big army with a lot of capabilities, but no general. They don't have a plan. You know, they don't have a list of bad guys to attack. You know, we used to have those lists of all those different, you know, the top 10 bad guys or whatever to attack.
The FBI's 10 most wanted.
10 most wanted list. They don't have that list. They actually require the good bacteria within your system to train them to figure out who the bad and good guys are. We actually know of bacteria, for example, the spore-based bacteria that I work with a lot in research, that can sit next to a bad bacteria in your gut and actually flag it for destruction by the immune system. It can actually go as far as saying, hey, immune system, here's a bad guy.
You hear a lot about biodiversity, right? You need all these different strains of microbes to calm down the immune system, but very few people know why this happens. And it turns out that the actual human body has little receptors that sit on our intestinal cells. And when we have certain species of microbes around, the dead fragments from these microbes will bind these receptors and send a signal to our bodies to calm down. Our immune cells are literally trained by microbes. when microbes are present, they tell our immune system how to behave. So if we're going to have a ton of these microbes around, we're going to have a diverse, well-trained immune system. So biodiversity means lower inflammation, calm the immune cells.
So this relationship that the gut bacteria, the so-called microbiome, has with our immune system can either be what's called tropic, which is positive. It can stimulate the immune system to be in the appropriate balance of recognizing truly foreigners, and it can be a vigilant part of our good health. Or if you get too much of the message of foreigners on board, then it shifts that immune system over into starting to have collateral damage to our tissues itself. This is really mediated through a very, very complex and beautiful regulatory system. If you think of the immune system as having so many voices, because the immune cells are differentiated into all sorts of different families, Th1, Th4, Th16, 13, 17, I mean all these different personalities of the immune system, and they're orchestrated by a kind of an upstream executive center called the T regulatory cell. And the T regulatory cell is in communication at the gut level with what's going on with the microbiome. So if you get a message from the microbiome as all is healthy here, all is fun, we have bright sunny days down here, then the T-reg cell sends out messages to all these other operative cells within our immune system to say, just keep doing your job, don't worry. But if the T-reg cell gets a message from the gut through these receptors that are triggering the messages ultimately to the immune system, then the T-reg cell will send out a different set of messages that then shifts the balance into what we call the Th1 response. This has a whole different family of immune cells that are more out there. They're now hypervigilant, on guard, and they're likely to start having collateral damage to the tissue itself that we're made of.
Did you know that the microbiome isn't something that you can glance over to see its history? In fact, this is something that goes back a long way further than that. It goes to time when you didn't know time existed. Perhaps all you knew was that you were upset that you'd be snatched from where you felt safe and comfortable. I'm talking about your birth.
What we're doing is we are destroying, we're bombing our gut microbiome. We're losing diversity that can never be regained. If you read Martin Blazer's work and many, many others, so many of the things we can start with from birth, cesarean section, which sometimes we can't help, but we're colonizing our infants with skin flora of the surgeon instead of the mother's vaginal flora, which is the normal microbiome. And then you go on to breast versus bottle feeding. That has a profound effect on the microbiome.
We are living in a world of bacteria. We are exposed to a lot of bacteria. However, our immune system during evolution developed a lot of mechanism to stop the bad guys, the bad bacteria, and open the door for the good one. In fact, when the child is born, in a couple of hours or a couple of days, he is acquiring the microbiome. He's acquiring it from his mother, from the family, from the house, from the environment, from a birth canal and whatever. And in a healthy physiological situation, he will carry this microbiome all his life. However, sometimes for many reasons that maybe we will talk about it, there is a disequilibrium whereby the dysbiosis is taking over and fighting our microbiome. And then, most probably, problems starting to appear.
So I've seen some of the studies that a child that is born natural childbirth, the child coming down the birth canal is covered in mother's bacteria.
Yes.
And that bacteria goes through the nose and the mouth and the ears. And
everywhere.
And so the baby is inoculated with the good bacteria.
You're right.
And some of that bacteria carries messages to help baby prepare for the environment that baby's coming out into.
You're right.
But when a baby is born by cesarean section, as an example, then the bacteria that migrates into the baby's intestines is the bacteria in the hospital room.
Right.
Or wherever the baby is born.
We're talking about the different population. Yes.
Different populations of bacteria that get in.
Right. Right.
And that those children who do not have the inoculation at birth, they tend to be more vulnerable to atopic diseases or skin diseases and allergies and asthma as they're growing into their childhood.
I'm a big fan of natural childbirth. I realize that a lot of women don't want that, but I also want to advocate for vaginal births for women whenever possible. You know, we have a rising cesarean section rate in the United States. There's some countries where the cesarean section rate is very, very high. It's funny, a lot of women have this perception, it's almost a myth, that cesarean section's easier. You know, they think, oh, well, I could just show up on a Wednesday at 8 o'clock and get my baby out.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth is that you want to have a vaginal birth for a couple of reasons. One is that a baby coming through the vaginal canal gets inoculated with the microbiome of the mother. So there's some inoculation that happens when the baby is still in the uterus, as you described, kind of the passive immunity of the mother. Mm-hmm. But there's this really important setup, kind of a foundation for the baby's microbiome that they get when they come through the vaginal birth canal. There's this exquisite kind of fine-tuning that happens before a woman gives birth. And when you have a cesarean section, you know, basically you get scrubbed and you get, you're not able to completely remove all bacteria, but there's an attempt made to make it as sterile as possible when you have a cesarean section. And we know that it's not just a problem with the microbiome when you have a cesarean section compared to a vaginal birth. We know that cesarean section babies have a harder time breathing. They don't have the same sort of stress response. So when you go through the vaginal canal and you're kind of all squished down into your fetal position, there's this moment when you give birth through the vagina where everything is kind of squeezed out and your lungs expand and you take your first breath, and you don't get that when you go through a cesarean section, you know, an incision in the belly. So there's the microbiome effect. There's also this stress response that's good. It's, you know, the scientific term for this is hormesis. It's a good stressor for the baby. To me, one of the most important things you can do to kind of help with the microbiome is to breastfeed. I mean, it's really simple. Breastfeeding is crucially important for setting up the microbiome and for helping the baby just have this foundation for digestion that will serve that baby for the rest of its life. So there's, you know, I breastfed my kids for about a year each. That's what's recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics. I think if you can go a little longer, that's better. It's amazing how it also impacts other issues like your body weight later, you know, your risk of obesity. You know, there's so many benefits to breastfeeding. I feel like we could talk for a few hours about that. But I think it's one of the things that you can put in extra effort. You know, and let me back up for a second. I think a lot of women have the best intention when they give birth. You know, they want natural childbirth, and they want to have a vaginal birth, and for whatever reason, they end up with a cesarean section. You know, our C-section rate, even if you're very committed to having a vaginal birth, is somewhere around 15 to 20%.
Is a C-section absolutely necessary? Truthfully, these procedures are done as a matter of convenience at times. Again, they are mandatory. It's been estimated by the World Health Organization that about 10% of births in developed countries are complicated and would require a C-section. Our rate is triple that. Let's say a child is born by C-section. What can you do? And there's wonderful work from New York University by Dr. Maria Dominguez-Bello. And she takes it right from the get-go that if a C-section is happening, and you know it's happened, that you should put a sponge, a 4x4 sponge, into the birth canal while mother is in the hospital, and take that out of the birth canal before the baby is born. It's covered with good bacteria from the birth canal. Then the baby's born by C-section. You use that sponge to cover its face, its nose and mouth in hopes of giving it the right bacteria. Now, there hasn't been a lot of study of that, but I wanted to discuss that because it is showing that researchers are really focused on the importance of this moment, birth,
yes,
in terms of creating that microbiome. Understand that what is being transferred at the time of birth, it's bacteria and other organisms, but it's information. That's what's key. Understand that 99% of the DNA in your body isn't the 23,000 genes that you got from mom and dad that represent your genetic legacy. It's in your gut bacteria.
And we've ruined our microbiome with all the antibiotics we're giving right from the get-go. Little babies are given antibiotics, wiping out their microbiome, or they don't get a microbiome because they're born by cesarean section. So, I mean, or populated by the, whatever's on the hands of the person who's handling them in the nursery.
Right, the surgeon or the nurse that's handling them afterwards. That's the microbiome they develop, is the bacteria on the surface of the skin of the surgeons, not mom's internal bacteria that they were pre-programmed to receive. And that bacteria is the library, if you will, of how that gut is supposed to develop.
It's messages, it's information.
Yes.
And this baby is born without that information.
Yes.
Which is horrifying. And the mom may not have such a great microbiome either, because she may have been on antibiotics, she may have been on all kinds of medications, steroids, whatever. She may have had vaccines with thimerosal in them that wipe out the gut bacteria. Or stress. Stress is going to do that.
Yes.
So cortisol does that.
Yes.
So we're in trouble.
There's some women who end up getting antibiotics when they're in labor. Either they have a sign of infection, like their uterus getting infected, or they're colonized with group B strep. And that's where you want to start being really careful about the use of antibiotics. So you want to be careful, at parturition, which is when you're in labor. You also want to be careful with your infant. Sometimes it's life-saving. They have pneumonia. They have to have antibiotics. But every time you give an antibiotic to a baby or to a child and an adult, you're affecting the diversity of their microbiome. Now, there's some situations where I think antibiotics are not needed, and that's a really important place to focus on. A lot of kids have otitis media. They have an ear infection, and physicians tend to give antibiotics, it's a way of dealing with 40 patients a day and just kind of like running them through, whereas it's often a virus that's causing the otitis media. So we want to just be really thoughtful and, have kind of this high bar for whether we give antibiotics.
I saw a study back in the late 80s that over 70% of recurrent ear infections, otitis media, over 70% of them were not a bacterial infection. And they identified a fungus or a yeast there. And when you give antibiotics, it has no effect. Except maybe to allow the yeast to grow more.
Right.
Because you reduce the competitive bacteria in the gut that's supposed to be there.
Exactly right.
So sometimes antibiotics are needed. Absolutely, they can be life-saving and life-protecting. But there's the indiscriminate use of them as a first option instead of as a last resort.
Right. And I think, we're at this point, we're at a tipping point with looking at the diversity of the microbiome. And we know that people who have a more diverse microbiome are healthier.
A lot of people who've been to Nepal, to Asia, to Africa, a very well-traveled outdoor group. And they may have gotten an infection, had it treated with antibiotics or herbals, and the bug is gone, but the signature damage is still there. And that signature damage is leaky gut intestinal permeability, altered microbiome flora. And there's some sound bites that I use with my patients to catch their attention. There's more bacterial cells in your body than there are human cells. That shocks people. Half the DNA in your body is not yours. That's how complicated the microbiome is. Most of the serotonin in your body is not in your brain, it's in your gut. And so once we can kind of look at these mechanisms that are proven in medicine and apply them to the unique individual, what's their story, what's their pattern, what's their prediction of where they're heading and trying to change the course of that natural illness. We see it with rheumatoid arthritis. There's several bugs that have been identified as linked to rheumatoid arthritis, and the mechanism of the bug causing damage, allowing food particles to interact with the immune system in the blood. They then go to a unique environment where the immune system has never seen them, and it attacks them. One of the common autoimmune tests is rheumatoid factor, which is not just with rheumatoid arthritis, but with multiple autoimmune disease. What is the rheumatoid factor? It's what's called an IgM molecule. It's an autoantibody to something, and we're not really quite sure what it is. And it may be a reactive antibody to multiple things that have created a abnormal environment in the body, and the body's trying to respond to it. I think we're just in our infancy of understanding autoimmune disease.
I hope you can see clearly the assaults that are on your important gut bacteria every day. I'm glad you've seen the clear and simple steps that you can implement to help stop the onslaught of toxins and triggers to your precious gut microbiome. Also, I'm glad you can see how you can take simple steps to rebuild the microbiome in your gut. Maybe you feel like you need some more information on how to do it. So let's dive deeper into this.
And this microbiome has to be in balance. And there's an extraordinary book called The Epidemic of Absence that details the history of the changes in our microbiome, the elimination of parasites and worms, and how that has actually led to this disruption in our immune response and this overreaction to our body's own tissues. Where we used to actually respond to parasites and worms and keep an equilibrium, they're not there anymore, and our bodies sometimes get triggered into this autoimmune response. And I think that there's a lot of things that disrupt our gut microbiome, right? There's our increasing rate of C-sections, breastfeeding, changes in our food supply, low fiber, high sugar, GMO-made foods may alter our gut microbiome, the overuse of gut-busting drugs like antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, antacid drugs, hormones, steroids. All these drugs alter our gut microbiome in ways that lead to imbalances. So when you end up disturbing the gut microbiome, it can also lead to a leaky gut. It can also upregulate inflammation in the body. So dealing with an anti-inflammatory diet and a hypoallergenic diet and optimizing the gut flora through the functional medicine approach of the 5R program, which is to remove the bad things, replace the nutrients and enzymes that are needed in prebiotics, re-inoculate with healthy bacteria, repair the gut lining with things like glutamine, zinc, fish oil, and so forth, and restore the body's equilibrium. These are all very straightforward processes we use with great success in autoimmune disease.
Well, let me just tell you about one particular client who had an undiagnosed autoimmune condition, probably lupus. It was early. She was having a lot of numbness in her arm, both arms, but mostly on one side. She had slightly elevated Smith antibodies and ANA antibodies. And her memory was, as she described it, going down the tubes. And she was under huge amounts of stress. And, you know, what we did was we changed her diet. And by changing her diet, we changed her microbiome. And by giving her more live foods, taking away foods that were inflammatory out of her diet. And it was really remarkable because within a couple of weeks, it was all starting to resolve.
Wow.
And within 3 months, she had lost 20 pounds. She goes, I lost 20 pounds without trying. I go, yeah, you just changed everything about the way you eat.
Change the microbiome.
You changed the microbiome, and also you rested 2 hours a day. We did a little bit of protein powder that had some nutrients that upregulated phase 1 and phase 2 liver detoxification. She was a yoga teacher, so she knew how to actually relax pretty well. And I said, you just need to stop 2 hours every day, because she was in a situation where she was completely overwhelmed. Remember I said it's that overreaction?
Yes.
And she was overwhelmed. And within 3 months, all of her autoimmune condition symptoms were 100% gone.
Wow. Amazing, isn't it? Restore your microbiome and watch your symptoms go away. You heard that right. Within 3 months, all of her autoimmune condition symptoms were 100% gone. Gone! That's the day of peace when the war has finally ended inside her body. So would you like to know what the first step is to check the gut's microbiome? Here's what you do.
And the more you work on the gut, the more individualized you're able to do it. But you've got to remove the offending bugs. You've got to restore the microenvironment. You've got to replace the flora with good bacteria. And it's really a restoration. It's a removal and restoration. I tell my clients it's kind of like the Amazon rainforest. If all you've got is trees, you don't have the biodiversity that you need. You've got to have all the orchids and all the ferns, and you've got to have that incredible diversity that you see in the rainforest. And I kind of see the gut as an internal rainforest. And so you have to pick what individually they need, use the advanced testing that's available to identify what the problem is.
We try not to get real hung up on what the disease or the pathology is. We run down the foundational elements, right? And one is, in autoimmune disease, particularly if they have a strong family history, we have to straighten out the gut. It has to be right. So I'll use sort of a molecular DNA-based testing where it's a stool-based analysis, and we map the GI microbiome. So we do a GI map that looks at the bacteria, the protozoa, the viruses, the fungi, and we can even do the virome now, like I said, with DNA, and we can look at what's there. The good guys, the bad guys, and the ones in between, the opportunists. We can look at the relative balances of those. And we're doing two things. We're trying to nudge them toward what we would consider an acceptable microbiota, a normal balance, and get rid of any overt pathogens. But with the opportunist, we're looking particularly for these organisms that we know in the literature today already have been either associated when they overgrow, or there's more DNA recovered than normal. They're associated with much higher incidences of these various autoimmune diseases. And if they have rheumatoid arthritis in their family history, I'm looking for Klebsiella overgrowth. I'm looking for Citrobacter overgrowth. I'm looking for Proteus overgrowth.
And yeast can make us feel lousy, not to mention really usher in more sugar cravings. This is a whole nother conversation around how gut microbiome can influence our taste, and dysbiotic flora can cause us to crave foods that really aren't good for us at all.
So dysbiotic flora means too much of the wrong kind of bacteria. And so you start craving foods that feed the bacteria. And it's a really good example with yeast and craving sugar.
Yes.
Are there some other examples? What other foods feed undesirable bacteria?
So sugars, simple carbohydrates.
Simple carbohydrates means refined grains, like white flour, white bread, white rice, things like that.
Things that are going to turn into sugar quickly in the body. Yes, so that will feed the bad bugs. And what's really interesting about these bugs that we're learning is that the bugs can actually produce some of the neurotransmitters that either make us feel good or make us feel bad.
So what we're doing right now is doing clinical trial on these spore-based probiotics that we work with for reducing gut permeability, or leaky gut is a common term. And so in order to do that, what we're doing is we're finding students that have leaky gut. And these students are young, they're healthy, they have no symptomology. Like you said, there's that period of time where things are happening in the body, setting it up for disease, but there's no symptomology. Right?
They've not killed off enough tissue yet.
Exactly, they're not killed off enough tissue yet. The inflammation is there, but the inflammation is starting to build and create more and more damage. We are finding in screening these students by giving them a certain challenge meal that would induce leaky gut, we're finding about 65% of kids are experiencing leaky gut.
Wow.
And this is in response to one single meal. It takes their body 14 days to recover from the inflammation from that one meal. The meal, of course, we're giving them is a McDonald's breakfast.
Wow.
To stimulate that leaky gutness. So these same 65% of kids, they're in their early 20s, mid 20s maybe, they are seemingly healthy, but every single time they eat food, especially the bad food and things like gluten, you're getting this huge toxic response in your body that you don't feel. you feel fine, but it's damaging tissue, it's messing up your immune system, it's confusing the immune response, and every single day of doing that over the next 10 to 15 years sets you up for every kind of autoimmune disease in your mid-30s, 40s, and 50s.
So we have a stool sample sent in, and we will get measurements of the predominant microflora, so the main players that live there, and we can look and see who is in balance, who's out of balance. We can look and see whether or not some of those autoimmune trigger bugs are present. And we can see if there are any pathogens, are there parasites, and on and on. Are there inflammatory compounds that the gut produces? Things like lactoferrin or calprotectin, eosinophil protein X, are these elevated? And then we go in there carefully, or I will design a protocol that will help to drop the bad guys, raise the good guys, quench the inflammation. And by and large, I'm using botanicals to do that. So antimicrobial botanicals. We've got this fabulous arsenal of
so these are herbs
that work.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, I'm using herbs. Mm-hmm. Long history, decent research on their efficacy, and you don't get the fallout that you do with antibiotics. Mm-hmm. Once in a while, I'll use antibiotics for certain circumstances, but by and large, I think we can do as good, if not better, with herbs. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Are there any foods that you recommend to help build the microbiome?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So there's a treasure trove of prebiotic foods. Mm-hmm. Biotic meaning bugs, pre meaning, well, before the bug, or what the bug eats to proliferate. So mm-hmm. there are many great prebiotic foods. Arguably, everything we eat is a prebiotic. Everything is going to be feeding our bugs. Mm-hmm. Are we feeding them healthy? Are we feeding our bugs what they need to be eating so they stay balanced and happy? Or are we feeding our bugs so the guys we don't want around are proliferating?
Food can affect our microbiome. What we eat does make a difference. I know you've been through the confusion. What do I eat? What don't I eat? And then there's the discouragement of feeling like no matter what you eat, the outcome will still be bad. Well, the truth is you can get better, feel better, and be on top of whatever challenge you might be facing. So what foods do you avoid, and what foods are most effective?
Probably the most important factors are food. So as we lose whole, real, live foods, which feed the microbiome, and we're eating processed fast food, I won't mention any names, or processed packaged foods. You think about the kids that take the Lunchables to school. I mean, what kind of a meal is that? That is not feeding the microbiome. And so what we're doing is we're lacking the foods that feed our microbiome. We're not just feeding us, we're actually feeding our gut bugs. And if we don't think about that, I mean, diet is key.
But I think really one of the even more important pieces is eating prebiotic-rich foods. These are soluble fibers that we find in foods like asparagus and onions and garlic and root vegetables and jicama. And these are the food for the probiotics, for all the beneficial bugs in our gut. Okay, so we focus a lot on probiotics, and probiotics are really by definition bacteria or fungi that have a specific strain that's known to have a specific health benefit in the human body. When they're actually in our microbiome, they're called probionts. And they live in big families. And we focus a lot on probiotics and probiotic supplements, and I think they're pretty fascinating, and I think that the research is going to explode in this area. And I think that we're going to find that there are certain probiotics that are great for certain health conditions, for certain people at certain moments in their lives.
Right.
I think where the real magic comes is in the probiotics we get in food, and also in the prebiotics, which are foods that have soluble fibers in them. And these soluble fibers that we find in things like asparagus and onions and garlic and root vegetables like yams, or things like jicama, bananas, most fruits, beans. These prebiotic fibers are so important in so many ways because they feed the probionts in the body. They feed the microbiota. And as the microbiota gobble them up, these prebiotics get activated and the polyphenols get activated so that they can work doing whatever they do to reduce inflammation and send our genes messages and say, hey, calm down, everything's really okay, why are you so upset? And primitive peoples really ate a lot of these prebiotic foods.
One of the things that we know about encouraging more of the beneficial bacteria is fiber from vegetable, the insoluble fibers from vegetable. And one of the concepts we've often recommended is varying the vegetables that you take in will determine which of the good bacteria you're going to be feeding.
Absolutely.
Are there any vegetables that feed bad bacteria?
One of the unfortunate things is that fiber in general can feed bad bacteria as well as it can feed good bacteria. So, and that in fact is one of the causes of why a lot of people have sensitivity to fiber. A lot of people will eat certain vegetables and actually get a lot of gas and bloating and cramping, and that's because the unfavorable bacteria is actually converting that fiber into methane gas or hydrogen gas instead of the good things like short-chain fatty acids that really help the gut. So bad bacteria can ferment fiber as well, but in general, if you eat a diverse amount of fiber, 7-8 different versions of fiber from vegetable sources primarily rather than supplements, you'll actually allow for the regrowth of enough good bacteria that they can actually suppress the bad bacteria themselves. So diversity again is key. One of the lecturers, both you and I spoke at a show yesterday, but one of the lecturers, Dr. Ben Brown, talked about how our ancestors used to consume upwards of 1,000 different types of foods in an annual basis, right? And we now consume, 22 foods maybe, right? And so one thing I always recommend to people is it's really hard to get a diversity in your diet if you're going shopping at Whole Foods or Jewel or one of your regular grocery stores. So what I tell them is, go to an ethnic grocery store. Go to an Asian market, go to an Indian or Pakistani or Lebanese market. You'll find roots and tubers and vegetables there that you won't find at your regular grocery store. And you don't have to eat a lot of it. You just have to eat a small amount of it, every other day, just to get the diversity.
What are there certain families of vegetables that seem to be of better or higher impact to the probiotics than others?
Yeah, actually, that's a really good question to ask because for the most part, resistant starches and resistant fibers tend to be better. So roots and tubers, like you mentioned, roots and tubers tend to have a higher degree of more resistant polysaccharides, and then polysaccharides is basically just long chains of carbohydrates. Some of them are more resistant to break down in the small intestines and get to the large intestine because that's where you really want it to get to. That's where all your fermentation is happening. That's where all the good bacteria are trying to feed off of the fiber and produce things like short-chain fatty acids, which lowers inflammation, seals up the gut, does all these wonderful things for you. So you want to use undercooked and long-chain polysaccharides. So things like sweet potato, for example, is much better than a regular potato. Sweet potato tends to have more resistant starches in it, and celery tends to be very hard to digest in the upper bowel. The types of cellulose and all that it has really is fermented well in the lower bowel. But in general, roots and tubers like maca root, those things, anything that's a root or tuber tends to have better carbohydrates in it than your simple fruits and vegetables.
Let's talk about how we might encourage a development of a more beneficial anti-inflammatory microbiome. You are renowned for one of your recommendations that you consistently talk about year after year to our healthcare practitioners in your lectures, and that one inclusion is about apples. Can you tell us about apples?
Sure. Apples are pretty much known to everybody as a healthy food, being 1 apple a day keeps the doctor away. And it's always been something I've known from primary school, and it was very exciting to me probably 10 years ago to discover that in a mouse model initially, giving the equivalent of 2 apples a day to these mice, you could induce the same level of inflammation control as around 10 to 15 milligrams of a steroid, an oral steroid. Now this immediately translated for me is how do we utilize that information?
May I just pause there for a moment? Sure. Just to process what you just said. So the equivalent of 2 apples a day will give you the anti-inflammatory effect of 10 to 15 milligrams of the most powerful anti-inflammatory drugs, the steroids, that our doctors use when they have no other options.
Correct.
2 apples a day.
When delivered to mice that had colitis at the time. So these mice were given a sulfate dextran, which is a triggering product to make the lining of the gastrointestinal tract get very inflamed. And when they split them out between the control, the apple and the steroid group, the apple and the steroid group roughly matched out at 2 apples to between 10 and 15 milligrams. How do we translate from little mice into humans was my next question. So I tracked apple studies for quite some time, and you'll be amazed how many you can find coming out now. But a big clue for this is that apples, when they're prepared correctly, and it's not eating them raw, but cooking them, and we do that by breaking them down, trying to keep some of the skin on because there are chemicals in that skin that are also useful. We soften it off. In England we call it stewed apples, and in America you call it apple sauce. But it's not the apple sauce that you buy at the supermarket. You cook and break down the apples until the surface of the apple begins to become viscous and shiny. And that's a product called pectin. And pectin mimics the lining of our gastrointestinal tract's production of normal mucopolysaccharides, which is a healthy fluid that we cover our cells with so we don't get direct contact. So when you eat apples that have been pre-digested for you by being cooked down, then we add some cinnamon, because cinnamon has a powerful anti-inflammatory component, and we add a few raisins so it's not too bitter, because we use cooking apples. And you eat that, roughly 2 apples a day. People with inflammatory bowel conditions or difficulty in maintaining inflammation control, if they can tolerate that, some people find they have to start much more slowly, you will reduce not only local, but systemic inflammation as well.
What might be some of the reactions that a person might have that would encourage them to take it a little slower than 2 apples?
Because apples are a carbohydrate, they have some sugars in there, some people may find that they get a bit windy. They feel a bit bloated, or they feel a bit like they want to burp because they're having it too fast. So normally what we do is suggest that they take some natural yogurt that's non-sweetened or non-flavored yogurt, preferably of an organic origin, and they take a little bit of that with it, and also perhaps a probiotic that's been recommended to them. And a probiotic is a capsule or a powder that contains organisms deemed to be helpful to human health. And there are different types. I mean, it's another whole discussion, but there are lots of different types. And you might just want to start off with 3 or 4 teaspoons on day 1, and then day 2, double it, and day 3, double it, and just see how quickly you can get to a position where you're comfortable. And it takes about 10 to 21 days. The average study is 28 days to change the population of bacteria inside your gastrointestinal tract that favor an anti-inflammatory response that impacts locally and then transfers that information throughout the rest of the body.
I learned from my great-grandmother that you don't find the answer to health in the bottom of a pill bottle. I think that's true with supplements too.
Yes.
I mean, sometimes supplements can make a big change. You know, it can be a small hinge that swings a big door. But for the most part, your food is so much more important. And I think a food-first philosophy here is crucial. And we know that they're good for you. I mean, even if we looked at my fridge, I've got about 20 different probiotic foods in there, and I've got about 10 different types of sauerkraut. I love miso, I love tempeh. You know, there's many different fermented foods that are delicious. And it's not as simple as just jacking yourself up on probiotics. No. It doesn't stick when it comes to shifting the microbiome. And really the goal here is to have diversity of the microbiome.
Yes.
So you're gonna have more diversity from eating fermented vegetables and fermented foods than you are from taking a probiotic. It just doesn't stick. It doesn't have the stick factor that we wish it did. Eating things like resistant starch, having probiotic foods, I think those are a much better strategy.
What we're looking for, what most of the studies have shown with regards to gut health, is you want to have a great diversity of bacteria within your gut, right? So the more diverse your gut is, the more functions it performs, the stronger your immune system is. And with that, the idea of overloading your gut with the same 3 or 4 strains every single day, if what you're trying to do is reseed the gut with those strains, what you're doing is just kind of overloading those same strains. You're not improving the diversity much. And at the end of the day, every study that's come out of the Human Microbiome Project, and people might not be familiar with that, but that's a huge NIH study that was launched in 2007. The U.S. government spent about $160 million in studying the gut itself and the bacteria within the gut. And so a lot of information has come out about the gut with regards to that. But what we learned from all of that work is that the diversity within the microbiome is so important. And the word microbiome, maybe you don't know what that is, but microbiome is the description of the entire population of bacteria and all the genetic elements within the host itself. And typically we're talking about the digestive tract, but you've got a microbiome on your skin, your eyes, virtually every part of your body. But again, the diversity is really what we want to go for. So we need something that is able to go in there and improve the diversity of the gut rather than just trying to reseed the gut with the same 2-3 strains every day.
So there's another part in relationship to the food. Even when you're eating good food, if it's not digested, well, some of it may move through because of opening or leakiness. The rest of it is going to go downstream, and it's going to feed the bacteria downstream.
Yes.
Right? They're not supposed to be seeing, whole vegetables and whole,
big
portions
of roast beef.
Exactly. So they get that, and so we see that the bacteria that are going to use that as feed begin to grow and overgrow.
Right.
This has several implications, the biggest one of which we still are investigating to understand the how, but there is a low-grade inflammation that is driven through that process of the imbalance of this term gut microbiome, this word that you and I heard about it 15 years ago when it was first established, but now it's all over. The White House is talking about it, as of yesterday. So the microbiome is altered and it creates this inflammatory process. And remember that I said not only do we see a genetic predisposition and an environmental exposure and impermeability, but also this inflammatory process. The foods that we eat and the things that we're exposed to are creating a low grade, sometimes a high grade inflammation that makes those fires burn, and the immune system drives off of that fire.
So with that, I remember back in the early 70s, we were chewing brown rice 30 times. You remember that?
Mm-hmm.
In the macrobiotic world, they would talk about that. And if you ever try chewing brown rice 30 times, just count it. 1.
It gets old.
It gets old, and it gets sweet. It gets really sweet. And that was startling to me to realize. And I did that once, and that was enough. I never do that again. But it was a good experiment. But it demonstrates that when you chew, the juices in your mouth, the salivas in your mouth help to break down the food, get it started, and they carry signals that go down to say, okay, make some acid down here. And if you're able to make the acid, then you start to break it down even smaller, so by the time it comes out of the stomach, it's ready, almost ready to be absorbed.
Right.
You need a little bit more enzyme, but it's ready.
Right.
So even good foods, if we don't have the apparatus working correctly, can still contribute to the mechanism of autoimmunity.
Exactly. And you reminded me of this kind of epiphany that I had one day. Michael Pollan has a wonderful little book called Food Rules, and in there are 64 rules. Each one is about a half a page. And I opened it up, I would give it to patients, but one day I opened it up and it said, eat at a table, ... a desk is not a table. And as a practicing physician, I'm often like, well, I'm going to have lunch and I'm going to sit down. I've got my good food and I've brought it from home and it's fresh and I've warmed it up, not in a microwave, and I'm eating it, but I'm at the computer and I'm looking at charts and I'm doing things and I'm answering the phone and I'm at my desk, and vagal tone, am I relaxed?
Yes.
No way.
No.
Even the best food. So you're right on it.
Just like our health is dependent on the quality of the foundational building blocks, the microbiome, in the same way, the quality of the food we eat is dependent on the environment in which it's grown. Watch this.
Some of the studies show now as well, we used to use probiotics ad nauseum, I still do. They have an important clinical place, but we can actually contribute to the monoculture of our gut by giving one strain of probiotic for long term.
Wow.
So back to food, because that increases diversity versus just probiotic strains.
Wow.
And back to things that actually, eating food out of the soil without maybe always washing it off, as long as you get it from a good source. I think that's a great idea.
Wow.
And if we go one step further, the health of the soil, which is lacking severely in the US, is a reflective marker of what's going to happen to our microbiome. Because the food comes from the soil, our microbiome is actually very connected to the soil. And as we're using these pesticides and chemicals on the soils, we are obliterating the soil microbiome. And of course, that in turn affects us because we're eating food from the soil that's lacking in nutrients, lacking in diversity, lacking in the microbes that we need to colonize our gut.
So we have soils that are poisoned with glyphosate, and you can't even grow organic in them, until you wait several years to get rid of the glyphosate. So we've got a huge problem right now. Even if we were to stop using it right now, we'd have to wait a long time before it disappears from our environment. And glyphosate has been shown to preferentially kill the good bacteria. We have strong correlations between intestinal infection and inflammatory bowel disease and celiac disease, all of those very strongly correlated with glyphosate usage on corn and soy crops. We can get that data from the U.S. government. It's freely available on the web, and I've looked at all these different data sets. I'm a computer scientist, so I can process data. And so the gut is definitely being hit hard by the glyphosate. And the soil, same thing. There's bacteria in the soil, and they are super important for allowing the plants to pull up the nutrients, just as the bacteria in the gut are super important to supply us with nutrients. And in fact, the pathway that glyphosate disrupts, which is the shikimate pathway.
The what?
Shikimate pathway. That's the pathway glyphosate disrupts. So that's the key. It actually does a lot of other things, but Monsanto focuses on that pathway, and they say, well, look, we don't have that pathway. Our cells don't have that. It's a biological pathway.
That humans don't have that pathway.
Yeah. So lucky us, we're safe, right? That's the argument. It's a false argument because our gut microbes do have that pathway, and they use it to produce incredibly important nutrients for us. And this includes, for example, folate. So it produces the aromatic amino acids, this pathway. And so if the microbes can't produce those aromatic amino acids, we can't get them because our cells can't make those amino acids.
So we know that the good bacteria in our gut have a strong influence on producing enough of the B vitamin called folate,
yes,
or folic acid, as most people have heard it in the past.
Yes.
And that glyphosate, perhaps the other inert ingredients in there, but specifically glyphosate, will interfere with our gut's ability to produce enough folate.
That's right.
The soil and us share some degree of commonality in that the soil has a phytobiome. Now that refers to a mix of fungi and different organisms and bacteria that share the space of the soil. And a healthy soil makes a healthy plant. And more importantly, the bacteria in the soil transfer information through enzymatic release to the plant's immune system. And the plant has an innate immune system, a bit like we were born with a system that's pre-encoded to recognize certain challenges. The plant has the same. The healthier the soil, the more vibrant the plant's immune system is, which means it can resist disease, it can resist infection from different types of organisms, and it can help defend itself against different insects. Now you might be thinking, well, why would a plant's immune system have any relevance for me as a human? Well, plants, when they have a healthy immune system, produce lots of chemicals which are called phytochemicals or plant-based chemicals. And the more diverse those chemicals are, the more nutrient-dense the plant becomes. And more importantly, that message gets conveyed to us when we consume it.
When we eat the plant.
Correct. So here's a very simple takeaway. Switching to a predominantly plant-based diet has the same incidence of benefit as giving up smoking in terms of future health risk. So statistically, if you move towards a diet that contains about 80% plant-sourced, as opposed to meat and fish-based, from a pure risk perspective, you roughly achieve the same level of reduction of risk as if you were giving up smoking. So that's a very powerful message. Obviously, there's lots of questions these days because of different eating styles as to whether a plant-based diet or a meat-based diet or a fat-based diet should be utilized. But let's just go back to these plants, because I think that the phytobiome, the way that we look after our soils, the way that we nourish our soils, produces the food that we ultimately consume, or the animals that we're going to eat will consume. They come with molecular messages, like little keys. And when we consume them, we release those keys by breakdown in the stomach, and they enter the gastrointestinal tract where there are locks. If these keys fit the right lock, it switches on a cascade of response that's so beautifully elegant that there should be a song written about it. In simple terms, certain types of vegetables contain something called aryl hydrocarbon ligands. It's a long, complicated name, but if the plant is cruciferous like cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, or onions, and they still have a bitter content, that means the immune system is still quite active. That bitter content is separated by enzymes, and it fits a lock inside our gastrointestinal tract and switches on a whole range of healing mechanisms. So it makes immune cells, it stops the gastrointestinal tract from being leaky, it facilitates appropriate compositional changes in the microbiome to favor an anti-inflammatory ratio. It improves peristalsis, so it reduces risk for constipation and makes people feel more comfortable. It changes the production of hydrogen sulfate, which is a gas that bacteria produce, which in small quantities has an incredible mitochondria, which are little powerhouses that live inside our will look for hydrogen sulfate in small quantities to switch off genetic transfer from mitochondria to the cell nucleus, which in turn diminishes the risk for cancer of the gastrointestinal tract.
If they asked me, let's say you're at a party, I mean, this happens to us all the time, right? What do you do? You know, they figure out, and everybody wants free advice, right? So if they said, well, I have autoimmune disease in my family or what have you, what could I do to be proactive? I mean, something as basic as take a probiotic, you know, eat real, whole, fresh foods, you know, don't eat junky foods. Be very prudent about your use of antibiotics. Be prudent about your use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. Hopefully you don't have to use them at all. But anything that causes leaky gut, excessive alcohol intake, you know, like I said, poor quality processed foods, that's all going to help the GI environment. It's going to help leaky gut. It's going to help the ecology in the gut. Eating fermented foods, all the things that we know are good for gut health is one thing. And I would encourage them really to go further, and that is to test which foods their immune system does not like. If you really want to be healthy, you got to get beyond this disease reactive care model. Because our healthcare system is not a healthcare system, it's a disease reactive system, right? So if you really want a healthcare system, you got to find providers like yourself, like myself, and many others now that can be your coach, basically, to kind of help you through this. So be proactive, find out what is unique to you as an individual, and work with someone that can help modify, you know, your behaviors, essentially. This is lifestyle medicine. That's the key to fixing all this chronic disease epidemic. It's not the next magic pill. It's not the next drug. I mean, I'm glad that there's a lot of medications out there. I wouldn't want to live in a world where they weren't available as an option if you're at that point. But this whole fantasy land that we're going to just come up with these magic drugs that are going to cure all these chronic diseases, it's a function of how we're living and our environment, and we have to deal with it there, as inconvenient as it may be for many people and for many commercial interests. It's the only way we're going to turn this around.
I kind of closed off and was my own island. It definitely affected my marriage and my time with my children, and made me sad. My oldest son would ask me every day that he saw me if I was dying, because I looked at people around me and I didn't see other celiacs struggling to the point that they had, you know, ulcers in their intestines, and I've had 9 surgeries total from celiac.
Did you want to give up?
Yes, I did. I wanted to die a lot. When you have ulcers and you have celiac, they pretty much consider that like a precancerous state, and it's a poor prognosis cancer. It's lymphoma, and people die from it. I mean, I'm back to functioning, and I actually am back to knowing what it's like to enjoy life, just to have hobbies and things other than medical. You know, not always. My life was just in and out of doctor's offices, and now I can actually live life and not have to base everything around doctor's appointments and being ill all the time.
Hi, I'm Dr. Hyla Cass, and I invite you to watch this really very informative docuseries on autoimmunity, its roots, how to detect it, and what to do about it. And it's all free. So I invite you, have a look, have a listen, enjoy.
In this next episode, you're going to learn about the challenging digestive diseases that make up a lot of the suffering that people are going through. You're going to witness the amazing transformations of people sharing their heartbreaking stories that came to an amazing turnaround. These patients suffered from and reversed colitis, type 2 diabetes, and gluten sensitivity with or without celiac disease. You'll also learn the connection of autoimmune disease with gluten sensitivity. You'll see the ways to test and see if your digestive system is healthy or not. You'll also find out the steps for treating the digestive diseases, as well as coming to understand that hydrochloric acid, it's made in your stomach, is essential for good digestion. Finally, you'll find the answers to questions we all want the answers to, which is what to eat for a healthy gut.